Oh, perfect.
Okay, we're live.
Hello.
Hello.
You're live.
I'm off screen because I'm setting us up today. Come and sit down now. Hello and welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Tessers.
I'm Caitlin Miller.
And we are both licensed therapists, but this is not therapy for very, very many reasons.
So many reasons.
Get this panther back up. We gotta pat her down.
It's all down.
We are usually joined by Marie Moran, who is an executive functioning coach and hosts this. Unfortunately, she's not feeling well today and won't be with us. We hope she feels better soon.
You
This is not therapy. What it is just an open conversation. Honestly, it's just streaming. But instead of streaming ourselves playing a video game like many streamers do, we're just streaming ourselves talking
I
about.
like to call it a stream of consciousness.
Yeah.
We love it when people comment.
We do.
Actually, do you what?
Well, I'll come back to that. You're right. We should finish the like coming on board stuff. We work at a group therapy practice called Effective Artistry that specializes in working with people who identify as neurodivergent and addressing executive functioning issues in the state of Illinois. So we do therapy we and our colleagues do therapy with people who are in the state of Illinois.
Mm-hmm.
We also have a couple executive functioning coaches who will do executive functioning coaching, work with people all over the world. This is just an open conversation. We're just going to talk about what we talk about, and whatever we talk about is influenced by what you all are saying to us. So thanks for being here. It's nice to have people, but unless any of you say anything in the chat, we're just kind of imagining who you are, who you might be, and what you might be interested in, factoring it into all the things that we say. But there's only so much we can do. And for any of you who are comfortable with getting into the chat and writing to us, we do appreciate that. And it will impact us. You know, this doesn't have to be question and answer, although questions are welcome. And whatever the two of us are discussing doesn't have to be that you say something that's on topic, right? Like we'll go wherever we go.
Yeah. It doesn't have to be about therapy stuff either.
Yeah,
it can be about anything.
Anything. We talk about a lot of. To me, everything's connected. So, but
what is therapy?
Yeah, we're here every Monday for an hour, and I'm really going to work on ending on time so I'm not late for my.
Especially today.
Yeah. So, how are you?
I am a little nervous, not to be here, but just nervous in general. And by here, I mean this stream. I'm happy to be on the stream.
Well, I figured that by the here thing, but to me, nervous is about there's something specific that I'm thinking about that I'm nervous about.
I would say a heightened awareness of an overactive nervous system.
Interesting. I would call that vigilant or maybe hypervigilant or.
Yeah. Can we make up a word between hypervigilant and neutral?
Vigilant?
Okay, I am vigilant.
On alert? On watch?
I think vigilant, I often picture like being around wild animals that could like kill you. And you're vigilant, like looking for them.
Well, wouldn't that match kind of the state you're in? It's like watching out for something.
But that's like causality.
Look,
That's why I mentioned the nervous system thing.
Vigilant and hypervigilant are words that I like. You know how I do. I have defined those words for my own purposes.
What do you mean by vigilant and hypervigilant?
Vigilance is monitoring for the absence or presence of signs that something might be happening. Meaning, if I'm
then
vigilant,
I am not vigilant.
If I am vigilant about an attack from an animal, for example, to use your example, then some of my attentional resources are being dedicated to monitoring for sounds and movements and smells that might indicate that. Yeah. And when I check for that, even though there's none of that there, I continue to check for it in case it becomes present, as opposed to like something where do we have milk or whatever, and I check it and I see yes we do or no we don't, and then I'm done.
So would you still call it vigilance if you're in a state of vigilance for maybe, I don't know, like 5 minutes looking for whatever the perceived threat is, and you don't find it, and then you just continue trying to look for it?
Yeah. So vigilance for me is, I don't know, I know it's funny because I suggested it as a word for a state. I don't use it as a word for a state. Vigilance is about dedicating resources to monitoring presence or absence. So in that case, I'm the amount of attention I'm paying to whether or not that something is there. If I'm monitoring for it for 5 minutes, then I'm vigilant for 5 minutes and then not.
Okay.
Where hypervigilant to me is one of those, like many things that use the word hyper or hypo or prefix, I guess, where it means too much.
Mm-hmm.
So hypervigilant is not like a definitive, observable, oh, you've switched from vigilant to hypervigilant,
Mm-hmm.
which is not, no matter what definition you're using, you can't like categorically define hypervigilance.
Yeah.
Or observably anyway. But to me, it means disproportionate, right? That like, if I'm out in the woods monitoring for signs of an impending animal attack, makes sense to some extent, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I'm sitting here talking to you on the stream and some of my attentional resources are dedicated to watching out for signs of a predator attack, that's probably more than is useful, more than is optimal to spend those resources.
That's actually helpful for me because sometimes I'll talk to people about vigilance, and I think it's useful to have hyper versus just vigilant.
Yeah.
Can you talk to me, Brandon, about the category comment you were making in our meeting before this stream? Because that is fascinating to me, and
Yeah.
I think it,
Is it going to make it more fun or less fun for me to actually say that categorical was not exactly the right word for me to use there, but just was a useful word to use there?
Tell me more.
All right, let me try and do that thing where I'm imagining who might be watching this and like bringing them up
I'm
to
sure
speed enough.
someone else is. Yeah.
What we're talking about is, like I talk on the stream all the time about talking about things and using language that is observable. There's another word that I've used a lot, conflate, which is when a person treats two distinct things as though they are the same, meaning you've conflated those two things. They've kind of become the same thing in your mind.
Mm-hmm.
And so I forget the specifics of what we were discussing, but I made some comment about there being a difference. Oh, it was, you asked a question,
Mm-hmm.
and I suggested reframing that as just stating that you're concerned. Do you mind if I use the specific question? That you asked something like, are you frustrated with me,
Mm-hmm.
of somebody? And I suggested stating, I'm concerned that you're frustrated with me. And you said that those are the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
which there are many ways in which they are the same or similar. But my point was that there are obvious factual observable differences, if nothing else, the word choices.
So do you think I'm concerned that you're frustrated with me has more utility?
Well, I did in that moment, but this is, I think, part of what you and I are talking about is that observing that two things are different. Two things are always different in at least some ways, even if they are the same or similar in many ways. And one of those things that two statements can be the same or similar is in the impact you expect it will have on somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
Or the gist of the content that you're trying to communicate. It basically gets across the same idea. It basically leads to the same response.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's part of, we're skipping past the actual distinction,
Mm-hmm.
as though the only thing that matters would be, well, if I'm going to get the same response either way, then they're the same. Does that make
So
sense?
in that example, it would be, I want to figure out if they're frustrated with me.
Yes, that's what you're trying to accomplish.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you would be the one.
Yeah,
to know,
that is.
so I'm assuming that's what you were trying to.
That's why I used a question to start, because I thought that questions are things that people are more likely to answer.
Oh, interesting.
Because I think if I said, I'm concerned you're frustrated with me, and then someone would be more likely to say, oh, I'm sorry to hear that, versus, are you frustrated with me?
I see. That makes sense. And also, point out to you right away that you already think that there's a distinction, a difference between asking versus stating, and that's
Yeah,
why
when
you
I
chose
ask,
to
I
ask.
feel like I'm more likely to get an answer that I would like to get, which is either a yes or a no.
Well, that makes sense, and depending on the person and the context and whatever, like I would agree. Um, but it's just interesting that you already, before me pointing out that there's a difference, you already are aware of there being a difference, or you wouldn't have selected the way you said it. Anyway.
Yeah, and that's the basic premise I use with conversations with people. If I would like a specific piece of information, I make sure to ask a question, and then if it's more of like observations and we can see where it goes, then.
Well, so here's the problem with asking is, what if they're not frustrated with you, but they are annoyed with you, for example? Would you not care to know that?
So then can I ask, how are you feeling towards me?
You can. And also, it's always, anything can be done. Again, this is not
okay,
about,
how would you analyze the utility of asking regarding a specific feeling?
It depends on the specific person and the context. And but in this case, to me, like in the case that we're talking about, to me, the most efficient thing is to just say,
oh, yeah. Oh, wow.
Okay, say out loud what just clicked because I want
the most efficient thing would be to say what I'm concerned that they're thinking, because if I just ask the binary, are you frustrated with me, then it pigeonholes the conversation into being frustrated or not frustrated, versus telling them what I observably think and then seeing where it goes from there. Because then, for example, if someone was annoyed, they'd be more likely to say, I'm actually annoyed, instead of, are you frustrated with me? No or yes. Like, I feel like it expedites the conversation for me to figure out whatever the negative emotion is, which is advantageous.
Sure, or there not being one, or other possibilities. And yeah, it's because I'm concerned is I'm informing you about my state, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, here's what I'm experiencing right now. What I'm experiencing is that I am concerned, I am worried that you are annoyed with me. So I'm giving you information that is about me and my internal state that you can't have, even if you could theoretically read me and maybe predict.
Do you think then it makes people less likely to be offended? Because if you're saying, I'm concerned you're frustrated with me, it feels like maybe less of an attack because it's more based off of my internal state.
I mean, again, people and context and whatever, like some people will be frustrated by that either way, or.
Can you tell that I try to solve every problem?
Yeah. But also, this is not news, and this is what we do. Like, this is who we talk to. Our people. We are people who try to solve every problem by thinking about it, which is what I mean about
healer architect.
That's what I meant. However long ago in our conversation, where I said we're not get stuff done people. I meant we're solve problems. We're ideation people, not execution people.
Okay, you need to talk to me more about this because the way I've encoded these memories are like so negative.
That's another characteristic of people who attempt to solve problems cognitively, is that.
So we don't get stuff done. Is that essentially I'm tempted to use the word archetype of the person who like brainstorms and decides how the problem will be solved, but isn't the person who actually solves the problem? So an example might be, oh, I know we can. I was thinking about like a mining company or something. Like, we can change our ecological impact on the area if we do X, Y, or Z, but you're not going to be the person going to the mine and changing the way it's set up to then have a lesser ecological impact on the environment.
Sure. Yes. And I want to respond to that and give some thoughts and stuff. I've been having fun theorizing about different language with this stuff recently, but also want to not leave the previous thing without some kind of like button on it.
Buttons don't exist.
It's true. It's an opinion word.
What's the button?
What I was trying the thing that I think might be helpful as a takeaway is giving people information about your state is different than asking people for information about their state. Even if you're predicting that in response to you sharing information about your state, I'm concerned that you are annoyed with me, that they might still give you information about their state, whether or not they are annoyed. That, yes, even though it depends on the person and the context and whatever, it is less directional. You're not saying, I need to know something about you. You're saying, hey, I want to let you know something about me. So that's a difference. Now, how that difference, that doesn't mean it's better to do it that way. right? Because context and all these different things matter. But that's what we were talking about.
Can you imagine a context in which it would be better?
So what?
To say, are you frustrated with me versus I'm concerned you're frustrated with me?
Sure, that specific thing,
Yeah.
or you just mean like asking how they're feeling over?
No, that specific thing.
Yeah. I mean, it would be if this is a relationship, like the person that I'm talking to and asking that is someone where we've had prior conversations, and I can be fairly confident that they and I are using the word frustrated in the same way, so that.
Okay.
Because otherwise you run the risk of, if I say, are you frustrated at me, and they define frustrated differently than I do, and what I think of as frustrated, they actually call annoyed, and so then they say, no, I'm not frustrated with you, and leave it there, but I'm still picking up on what I'm picking up on. Or even let's say, no, I'm not frustrated, but I'm annoyed or irritated or some other word. Doesn't that happen in conversations a lot when you ask someone if they're frustrated? It's like, no, I'm not frustrated, I'm irritated.
I was just imagining the ways I could fix the website, so I got distracted.
Anyway, that was my point here. Is one, let's assume that you get the same response either way from saying I'm concerned versus are you.
Mm-hmm.
That could be a way in which those things are similar,
mm-hmm.
but a way in which they're different is asking for information about what they're experiencing versus sharing information. So that's one way in which they're different.
Mm-hmm.
Along with like the specific wording is another. So there's always, no matter how similar two things are, there are always differences. And yes, even things like, for example, autism is a categorical label, right? That, or autism spectrum disorder, right? That doesn't mean, even though multiple people, theoretically, every person who has that diagnosis is similar in the ways in which they need to be similar in order to get that diagnosis. They're similar in that they have that diagnosis, etc. There are also a bunch of ways in which they're different.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, the utility is about, are they same in the ways that matter to me right now? Or are they in the ways that they're different, potentially going to impact what happens here?
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, silly example, but this is the metaphor that popped into my head is if somebody I know is a huge hockey fan,
mm-hmm.
and then I think, well, hockey is a sport, and so is football, and so they're a sports fan, and now I start talking to them about football, but they don't like football, they like hockey, right? Like the similarity in that case of, yes, they like sports, accurate,
mm-hmm.
but in that particular case, the difference of hockey versus football matters.
Yeah.
In other cases, when you're saying, oh, you know, I want to join a sport for my, extracurriculars or whatever,
mm-hmm.
for college admissions later, then hockey and football being different doesn't necessarily impact that much.
And I would say context. You're not going to get into the college football team or hockey team.
Yeah.
You might as well join debate club.
So I'm just saying it depends what you're trying to do. Now,
the ecological impact of the mind, the person
yes.
who's someone solves problems cognitively, but we're not the type of people who get stuff done, and me being so offended.
All right. I have a lot about
every
this.
day, that's all I do.
I just want to make a quick note that in my mind, I was like, for this year, one of the things I want to work on is doing more like practical and specific answers, and we're not doing that today, and that's okay.
Oh, did you say that in the first stream?
No, it's just something I've been thinking myself.
How is this not practical? I'm actually tracking this as practical.
Some of this is practical because practical does mean able to be put into practice, and
mm-hmm.
yes, you can like change the way that you speak. I guess what I meant is more specific. You know, like this is practical, but we're not talking about specific language.
Well, I think the main way for us to be specific is for people to comment.
And ask specific questions.
Yeah, because it's so hard to.
It's one of the things I say, like every time I give a presentation is general questions get general answers, specific questions get specific answers. And then I also, because I'm me, define general and specific for people. That general means the more general something is, the more information you are leaving off of the thing in order to make it so that it applies in more cases.
Mm-hmm.
So the more general something is, the more frequently it applies, but the less impact it has in each case to which it applies. Whereas specific narrows down how frequently it applies, but makes it more impactful in that case. So
Yeah.
a general way to describe a day would be to say a day. That applies to literally any day. And in order to be something that applies that generically, it must contain very little information about the thing. All we're identifying about the thing in this case is that it is a day.
Well, and don't you usually veer towards the side of specific questions and specific answers?
No, actually, I don't have a preference. In
It
fact,
feels like that's where we continuously land, though.
is what?
Is a specific question and a specific answer, but maybe that's just a product of you asking people often to clarify language.
Well, sometimes people are looking for a specific answer and then ask a general question, or vice versa, ask a general question but want a specific answer. And in those cases, yes, I will then try to get more and more specific information. So for example, to use our same silly metaphor here, if someone were to say like, how do I make sure that, I have energy at the end of the day?
Mm-hmm.
And in that question, the only thing that has been given about the only information that's been given about the day that they're trying to have energy at the end of it is that it was a day. And so
then you might get a general answer of you either figure out how to have more energy or you use less energy.
Yeah, you use less energy earlier in the day, or you recover more energy throughout the day, or you increase the amount of energy you have just generally.
Yeah.
Because when it's that generic,
yeah.
But in that case, often people are looking for like, no, I want something that I can like, not a way of conceptualizing or understanding it, but like an actual do this thing. And in order to
That's
do
a
that,
big tension in therapy.
Yeah, this comes up all the time.
All the time.
And like on the stream, for example, especially when we don't have people putting stuff in the chat like today, we're going to default more to general because I don't know who might be watching this and I have very little specific information. So I'm trying to make it as broadly applicable as possible. The things that are practical, but also general, most of the time I refer to those as frameworks. So like we've talked about, for example, if someone's saying, I get overwhelmed or stressed out or whatever by this particular sensory sensitivity, and without more specific data, what we can say is either reduce your exposure to that type of input or interpose something between the source of that data and your sensory organs, like headphones if we're talking about auditory sensitivity, or learn how to develop frameworks so that you're able to utilize that data.
I'm sorry, I was just thinking about how excited I am for the person you said who might be moving closer to the office.
Oh yeah, it's very exciting. One of our colleagues has a long commute and is considering moving closer to.
And not even just like 30 minutes.
Yeah.
So close. I could hang out with them.
Let's move on from that before giving too much specific information. Anyway, so yes, because I know that generally speaking, people will want very specific suggestions, like the answer they're looking for, the kind of answer they're looking for to the question of how do I have more energy at the end of the day is something like take a nap or, eat some protein before.
Yeah, and for a lot of our clients, it's an interesting thing because sometimes when I ask more questions, they seem a little bit annoyed. Like, isn't this such an obvious problem? Why are you asking all these questions? But then when we finally figure out a relatively stable solution to the problem, they're like, oh, finally.
Yeah, well, that's one of the, in fact, I can't think right now to say that this is definitively the case, but I kind of think that almost universally that's something that happens at the beginning of therapy, that when someone is struggling with a problem in their life that is persistent, like it keeps coming up over and over in different contexts. A, they've already identified it as a problem, which means B, they've already tried to solve the problem. By the time they're going to therapy to talk about the problem, like they've been trying to solve it a lot.
And I know for me, sometimes as a client, when my therapist asks me questions like this, I'll be like, well, this is a problem I've had for so many years. I understand every nuance of it. Why do you keep asking me this annoying question?
Right, so and that's the thing.
It's almost like the devil you live with every day.
Well,
it's like I know them very well.
By definition, if you had all the information necessary to solve the problem, assuming that the problem is actually solvable.
Mhm.
And, if you have all the information and resources necessary to solve the problem, then it would have been solved. You want to solve it. This is one of the reasons that I attack the idea that the reason people don't do things is because they don't want it enough so hard,
Mhm.
because it is an answer that gets in the way so frequently,
Yeah.
where someone will say, no, I definitely understand everything about this problem and know everything about how to solve it. And the only reason it's not getting solved is because I don't want it enough.
Yeah.
No, that's not real. That's not a thing, right? Like
Yeah.
anyway, so then you're stuck with this, like, I've been trying to solve this for a very long time, and especially if you're the kinds of people like we're going to talk about here in a second, like us, that focus on ideation over execution, then it's convenient and likely that you're going to be thinking, no, I already know how to do it. I just can't get myself to do it. Or when you finally come to the point of saying, no, that's not it, if you do get to that point, then you'll say, well, I guess I just don't know how to do it.
Mhm.
And I just need an idea of how to do it, and then I'll be able to do it.
Mhm.
Very rarely does it get considered that, like, sometimes the thing you're describing in such a general way that it is impossible. So for example, like, how do I have energy left at the end of the day? If you're talking about it in that general of terms, then you can go 6 days where you have energy left at the end of the day, and then you have a 7th day where you don't, and you say, I still haven't solved this problem because of how general.
So what would you say to a client who says that? Like, let's say they have a first session with you and they give you a mostly general picture of something and you give a general suggestion and then they take it.
I wouldn't probably give a general suggestion in that context.
So then would it be more in a context where
my first thing would say,
like,
if the client said to me in a first session, how do I have more energy left at the end of the day? I'd say, well, tell me more about what's the problem here. What do you mean? Like, what are you experiencing that you're defining to me as not having energy left at the end of the day? What problem is that causing? Because in that particular case, most of the time they're going to say there's something that they're intending to do at the end of the day, like clean up their house or work on their art that they're not getting to. So the actual question is, how do I get to cleaning up my house or working on my art more frequently or whatever? In which case, some of the solutions, for example, might be to do that thing earlier in the day. But when you've defined the problem as, I just run out of energy at the end of the day, then you don't consider the possibility that you could attempt to do those things at a different time. And I'm not saying that's the solution or whatever. I'm saying we got to figure out what people are aiming at. This is where I call it, I don't know if you've ever, I don't know if I've talked about it on stream, aims and measures. Is
you probably have. You've been doing this stream for like 100 years. It's amazing.
To me, aims and measures, it's a concept in language that I use with clients where the aim is like the actual thing that I care about. And when I have an aim that is very difficult to assess, sometimes because of how general it is, but sometimes because even if it's specific, it's difficult to observe, then instead we'll select a measure, which is a stand-in thing. So a very common example of this is that someone will think, I want to feel better about my body, or I want people to perceive me in a different way than they do, or I want to have more energy throughout the day or be healthier or whatever. Like, that's what they care about. But those are very difficult things to actually track. So whenever you're attempting a strategy in order to improve that, it's very difficult to see, like, is this paying off? Because it's very hard to track the outcome. So then instead people will select a measure, a thing that they're using to measure whether the strategy is helping them get closer to their aim. And in that case, commonly it's weight, right? That what I care about is how I feel about myself, how I feel energetically, and how I'm perceived. But I can't really track those things. So I'm using weight as a stand-in to say, if I do something and it makes my weight go down, that probably means that I'm also feeling better and having more energy or whatever.
That's not good though, right?
No, that's terrible.
Okay, good. Let's just be clear.
Yeah, that specific example is a terrible measure.
Yeah, Brandon is not giving.
No, I'm just defining what people do.
No, I have lots of clients who will think that too, like, all the roads lead to I need to lose weight, and then you ask more questions and it's like, oh, no. Yeah,
nobody cares initially about weight. Weight is an irrelevant number it does have correlations to other things that people care about. It's not completely nonsensical to pay attention to that as a
Yeah,
way of
it still
measuring
means
things.
something. I just think it doesn't mean as much as
But the problem
almost
is,
all of us.
there's something here that I definitely talked about on the stream before, and I believe that the technical name for it is the Goldman effect or Goodman effect, but more colloquially is often called the Cobra effect. And what it states is, the moment that you select something as a measure, it ceases to have utility as a measure.
Whoa!
Because the reason we're selecting it as a measure, right? Grades is another example, like weight, a very common one. Where does anybody give a crap about what somebody's grades are? No, not initially. What I care about for my child is I want them to be happy and successful in life or whatever. What I care about for myself is I want to know that I can accomplish these things. I want to set myself up for a good future. I want to whatever. And those are all very difficult things to measure in this case because they're so future oriented. So instead we use as a measure school performance. And we treat it as a valid measure that the better you do at school, the more we feel confident that you will be happy and successful in life. And again, there are reasons to select that. But once you select it, it ceases to have utility. Because the reason you would select it as a measure is because there is theoretically some intrinsic connection between the measure and the actual thing you're aiming at. So for weight and for grades in both cases, yes, it is sensible in the first place to think, well, you know, me feeling more energetic has correlated with me weighing less or whatever. There can be, not always, but there can be stuff to that. But the moment that you select it as a measure, you now optimize for the measure. So this is the problem, among many other problems with weight. This is one of the problems, is if what I'm actually caring about is looking attractive, you know, being perceived as being attractive by people. There are reasons, especially in our culture, to think, well, weighing less will equate to being more attractive. But as soon as you select weight as the measure, now all of your strategies are aimed at getting weight down, even if some of those strategies actually make you be perceived as attractive less frequently by other people. So you now start using,
interesting.
Same with grades, for example, that if there's a reason to think that school performance would have some correlation to future success. But as soon as you now say, well, then that means we should treat grades as an accurate measure of future success, now we have to optimize for grades, even if the strategies that we're then using, for a very common example, lead to cognitive and emotional burnout in high school, which kind of makes it hard for me to be successful later on.
Is that where that, like, the person that we used to know talked about the college crash of, like, high achieving high schoolers, that they, like, work super hard and burn themselves out and they make it into a college and then, like, freshman, sophomore year, it's just...
I don't know what you're talking about, Andy. I don't know what I've mentioned Andy on the stream as a mentor of mine.
I just don't know if that's like a direct enough quote to be able to
I don't know.
it to him.
I couldn't speak to what he meant by that, but I would say that yes, it is a very common thing, at least in my work, to see kids who work very hard and are successful in high school and then get off to like all with the aim of going to a very prestigious college, and then they get there and before the end of the first semester they're on medical leave. You know, and I think there's a lot playing into that. But some of it, yes, is the hyper focus on grades and academic performance for sure.
So a commonality I'll see in a lot of my clients who begin therapy with me is some version of, I've pushed so hard for so long, and usually that's from like 13 to 35 or something, and at some point their bodies break down.
Sure. Yes.
That is a general statement.
It is. That's why
Very general.
That's why I'm
statement.
hesitating with it, because that absolutely is a thing that happens and can happen. But there's so many
in
other
a way
things.
that is like so bad that you could probably reasonably say the breakdown is so intense that you could probably reasonably say that it would have not otherwise happened without pushing yourself so hard.
Yeah, there's often times that you could say that reasonably, although never definitively, because we only have one.
You know, it's a really interesting thing, Brandon.
What?
I think Something that's very interesting to me about COVID is it feels like a sociological wild card that like no one was accounting for. And so it's interesting because a lot of deterioration of people's physical and mental health, I feel like COVID had a big impact on in many ways, but I don't know.
I agree.
Because I think the average person talking about a life will be like, oh, these are the things that typically happen in 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. But now all of a sudden it's like 3 years disappeared and
well, in that
so
sense,
much illness.
I still agree, and I want to be very careful in my wording here.
Okay.
I still do agree, and a lot of that has to do with the actual like physiological and biological effects of a COVID infection, to the best of my very limited knowledge about it. I'm not a doctor, whatever. Some of that, I think, how do I phrase this?
Sociological phenomenon?
So something that is more true recently than it was, like it has gotten more and more true over time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's always more true than it was before now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that, again, this idea that accomplishment and motivation or desire or like moral fortitude or whatever equate, is that people have been trained and conditioned to treat their observation of their own physiological state like through a lens of analysis of whether it's justifiable or not.
Yeah.
Right? That people will be exhausted and then they'll think, why am I exhausted? Not because they're trying to evaluate how to change it, but because they're like, no, I don't think I should be this exhausted.
Yeah.
And then they run through all this stuff in their head and say, yeah, no, I'm just feeling lazy or whatever, because they can't intellectually and logically say, this is exactly why I feel as exhausted as I feel right now. So people are trained and conditioned to ignore their own sense of exhaustion. And in fact, in that particular case and way, thinking of it as just feeling lazy, not only trained to ignore it, but actually trained to respond to it as though it is indicative of the exact opposite, right? That exhaustion is a sense that theoretically exists in humans for as a way to signal to us that we need to slow down and like ease up.
Yeah.
But we've been conditioned to respond to it as a sign that we should push ourselves harder. And so there were many, many things that were already happening, like cycles and patterns that were already happening that accelerated after the beginning, the early days of the COVID pandemic for similar reasons. And a lot of that was just everybody all of a sudden having all this time on their hands by themselves in their houses to like,
let's just be clear that not everybody, some
yeah,
people.
I don't mean literally every single person. I
Yeah.
mean, as a general rule, that generally speaking,
yeah.
People had more time isolated into their individual living situations than they did prior to that. And honestly, there are probably very few exceptions to that, to the idea that it was more than it was previously.
Yeah, I think everyone was more isolated, but just for the people who still had to work in public, I think it's worth acknowledging.
Well, I don't know if most is right, but many, maybe most couldn't isolate completely. I'm not saying completely isolated.
Yeah, I've noticed this on some of the podcasts I listen to with like relatively blah, blah, blah people, is some version of, oh my gosh, I just had so much free time in my beautiful home. I'm like, not like that.
Well, as a quick side note,
yeah,
and I know this is not an intentional reference to previous conversations you and I have had about technology, but that's one of the things that really upsets me in conversations about technology is when people will say, turn off the screen and go outside, as though going outside is always a pleasant or viable or safe option, because it is not. And the people who are suggesting that, I really have a problem, for example, with I don't even want to call it a documentary because I don't think of it as one, the Social Dilemma that came out back in 2020 or 2021, where like they're filming people, these wealthy retired tech executives in their homes and I have a specific image of a memory of one of these people sitting in front of their like floor to ceiling windows overlooking a literal forest, not even like suburbs, talking about it's important to get outside into nature and whatever. It's like, yeah, okay, you don't live in an area where going outside involves like risk, like, and I'm not even just referring to things like the inner city and under-resourced areas where there is risk of crime and things like that, although that's part of it. I'm talking about like literal war-ravaged areas of this world where like, no, I'm not sending my children outside to play in the middle of a war zone. So thank God that I have some way for all of us to be able to engage with the outside world without having to physically leave.
Which is
totally
amazing.
The technology is incredible. That doesn't mean that it's never used in a problematic way, but this is like a historical thing that humans who are well off will respond to the development of new technology as though the technology itself is problematic and no one should use it, because it behooves them to reinforce the status quo because they're already well off. And anything which changes that up is just unnecessary, right? Like, why do we need
What about like the tech, I don't know, startup obsessive people who are like obsessed with change because they think they can make a ton of money out of it?
Those are people who are not already okay with the status quo. They're wanting to make a lot of money. So they're excited
some
about
of them
new
are
technology.
already wealthy, right?
Well, sure, but if they're wanting to make a lot of money, they're not okay with things continuing.
Oh, the way they are. Oh, I get what you mean now. Okay,
so
thank you.
The more that you want things to be different, the more excited you get about the technology, generally speaking. And yes, it is a historical thing to respond to the technology as though it itself is inherently problematic and should not be widely adopted. Whereas the people who are actually interfacing with it and using it and whatever are much more pragmatic and saying like, no, let's use it for the things that it is useful to use it for, while also recognizing that there are ways in which using this is not great. People had the same response to the invention of the printing press as they have to the invention of the internet. Like, oh no, letting all this information out into the world, like, it's going to cause fun. We still didn't get back to
We should be done in 8 minutes.
Okay. Backing up. I don't even remember all the tangents at this point, but you were asking about the ideation versus execution thing.
Yeah.
So here's what I've been thinking lately. Where do I start? Humans, I've said this for a long time, humans both collectively, like as a species, but also each individual human, we are fantastic at solving problems, coming up with solutions to problems which have not been solved yet. Absolutely, literally, by like whatever metric you want to use, we like seem to break the laws of the universe in the way that we do this, right? Like nothing else in the observable universe responds to novel problems and solves them the way that we do. It's what makes us human. Not to say that there's not theoretically things out there, but as far as we know, what we're very terrible at is like revisiting existing solutions to reevaluate whether they're still useful or optimal. Like sometimes they're no longer necessary. We could stop doing them, and the initial problem they were intended to solve is still gone now because the context has changed. Sometimes they're suboptimal, right? Where the problem would still persist if we stopped doing what we're doing, but there are new and better ways, better options that we have, but we're not evaluating for that because we already have a way of solving the problem. So the problem isn't happening, and therefore, like, necessity is the mother of invention, right? Like, why explore whether there's a more optimal solution to this when it's not actively a problem?
Yeah, I was just thinking about someone who really annoys me because they were doing that.
I mean, this is a super common, like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, or, well, it certainly worked for me the way I've been doing it my whole life, but, etc. Sometimes things have shifted to the point where not only is it suboptimal or unnecessary, but it is actually problematic now that the solution we're enacting is causing problems, even though it's unnecessary or suboptimal. And sometimes it can still be necessary and optimal and still cause more problems than it used to cause because of changes in the context. So here's what I've been thinking. To solve a known problem with a known solution requires execution, right? You just have to enact the existing solution. and I'm
You
glossing
mean not
over.
the existing solution, the new solution?
No, I'm saying
Oh, okay.
when there's a problem with an already existing solution,
Mhm.
you just have to execute
Mhm.
the existing solution. And I am glossing over that there's always, like if the solution to I am dirty, I take a shower, like there's always specific details and whatever that need to be paid attention to and accommodated for in every specific case.
Mhm.
So it's not to say that like farming is not something that requires thought and effort and problem solving. It does. Your particular plot of land and how it's looking and what blah blah blah.
Mhm.
But just to say that in whatever terms we're looking at, right? This is a problem that we've encountered before and a solution's been developed, so now it just needs to be executed.
Mhm.
Thinking back to like early evolutionary ancestors where, okay, we need to eat food is the problem, and the solution that has been developed is, well, you can hunt for food in this way, you can forage for food in this way, or whatever it was.
Mhm.
Then we just need to execute that.
Mhm.
To solve a novel problem, so when something new is happening that we have not responded to in the past, requires both ideation, coming up with what to do,
Mhm.
and execution, actually doing it.
Mhm.
The vast, vast majority of problems that we all deal with are not novel,
Mhm.
not in any significant,
Mhm.
meaningful way.
Yeah.
We literally every time you take a breath is the solution to a problem of losing oxygen in your blood, in your.
Well, and I'm
Some
also
of your
thinking
body.
about it in the timeline of development as human beings, that there have been so many humans solving so many problems for so long that.
Right. And a lot of the solutions to those problems create new novel problems.
Yeah.
That's one of the things with technology.
Yeah.
We solve the problem of not being able to communicate with people in certain ways.
Yeah.
And now that creates this new problem. Now that we can communicate with people in this way, here's this new thing we've never experienced before.
Yeah.
Now, ideation and execution are both theoretically taxing things, but like coming up with novel solutions to novel problems is a very resource intensive thing to do. And just thinking like evolutionarily, I'm talking all in theoretical terms. I'm going to try and go faster to get back to the actual answer. But
Yeah.
there's a spectrum, right? Where if everybody's thinking, ideating, gathering information and attempting to solve novel problems all the time, that increases our odds collectively because there's more people doing it.
Mhm.
The downside is there's still a bunch of stuff that needs to be executed.
Mhm.
So if everybody's ideating and executing, then the optimal balance is for everyone to spend the vast, vast majority of their resources on just executing existing solutions. And like anything else, it's a skill that the more you do of it, the more efficient you become at it.
Mhm.
So on the other end of the spectrum is only having one person who's responsible for ideating solutions to novel problems.
Mhm.
Because thanks to communication, only one person needs to come up with the idea. Even if everybody needs to execute it,
Yeah.
only one person needs to have the idea. So on that end, you'd say optimally, well, that person becomes the best that there could be at ideating, and they execute not at all
Mhm.
because they're leaving all
That
that to
sounds
other
so
people.
lovely.
So there is a theoretical balancing point between those two.
Yeah.
And what would be optimal in terms of evolution and community structure and whatever, what would be optimal is there is a certain number of people, the minimum number of people we can have within a given community, like ratio wise, who are dedicated as much as possible to ideation. So that they get as efficient as possible, and everybody else knows when there's a novel problem, you bring it to those people,
Yeah.
they tell you what to do, and they don't execute so much because they're spending all their resources on hiding it. So I do think there is an intrinsic tension between the more you think, the less you execute. There are things that draw on the same things. So yes, people like us and like most of the people who watch this stream, and I would say, because to be clear, I don't think of this as a genetic thing as most people do, right? That people think of intelligence as a genetic trait. I think it's much more context dependent than that, right? That like, if there's a community with nobody that's thinking a lot, somebody's going to start, or the community dies the first time there's a novel problem that they can't solve, right? And because of how our culture and all these different things, like collectively, all of us in this culture are becoming more and more skewed to the ideation versus the execution.
Mhm.
And I should say too that even in that case, I still think that people who are as far as you can possibly go towards ideation, still overwhelmingly their resources are spent on execution. The maximum amount a person can
It
think.
annoys me so much.
Why?
Because I always think to myself, oh, it would be lovely if some other human beings could do these things for me.
Well, sure, but I'm talking even about like you have to eat food and
Yeah,
like,
I know. I'm thinking about the things that are not optional that could be given to another person to do, like making the food, or cleaning the house, or doing the laundry,
right, and
or driving the car.
all of these things are things that commonly with people who have enough resources to be able to offload those tasks onto others,
They do. Yeah.
But I'm saying even in that maximal case, like of all the calories that your body burns, some percentage of those calories are burned on autonomic, non-optional.
You have a couple minutes.
Okay. So theoretically, the optimal like balance of this is to have as few people as possible thinking as much as possible, and therefore executing as little as possible. And if you think through like structures, societal structures, even into like archetypal, prehistoric ones, which we don't actually know. That's what I'm saying, archetypal. Then it is still like, okay, most people are out there doing stuff that just needs to be done. And we have a couple people in the community, who are, whether we're talking about like the spiritual leader of a community or whatever, some of the people in the community who are really thinking and communicating. And when there's a problem, you go to that person for thoughts and advice. And like, historically, that's what defines leadership and all these different things. So yes, I do think that people who are more intelligent by my definition, which means spend more of their resources on a cognitive environment, on ideation, are by definition less skilled at execution. Now, comparisons like this work two different ways. One is as compared to other people, saying that you're bad at execution compared to other people are. One is as opposed to other things you do. You're bad at execution compared to how you are at thinking.
That's the biggest thing.
And ideation and execution are both very generic ways of talking about it. They're actually domain specific, right? Like I'm better at executing some things than most people are because it's stuff that I do a lot, even though I would say in sum total, I'm more on the ideation than the execution side.
Where are you going with this, Brandon?
Well, this was an answer to your question you asked about when I said we're not people who get stuff done. I mean, again, in reality, we do stuff more than we think, no matter what. But that in two ways. In the first way, that it's a better use of our resources to be dedicated to the ideation than to the execution, like you just said, offloading as many of these tasks as possible. And that's not unique. Everybody wants that, right? Like everybody would love to have other people do the stuff that's necessary or beneficial, but not interesting to them or not enjoyable or whatever.
But I don't think a lot of people want to replace that with like thinking and solving difficult problems. I think a lot of people would replace it with like things with moderate cognitive effort that they enjoy.
I have some thoughts about that, but we don't have time to get into all that.
Thanks
briefly, I would just say that whatever people enjoy, if they consciously identify it as enjoyable, likely involves a lot of cognitive effort. And that's part of the solution, right? That distinguishing between I enjoy playing a video game, which requires a lot of cognitive effort and ideation and novel like gathering and blah, 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 is not distinguished in that way in like cognitive resources from writing a book or whatever. There are other ways in which they're different. But all the like even things that you think of as manual tasks like knitting or whatever, like it occupies some of your cognitive. Anyway, so that's what I was referring to. And yes, that does play a lot into neurodivergence and especially ADHD and executive functioning and whatever. The more you think, the less you act, period. That's what we mean when we say be careful. Like if I'm being careful in doing something, I'm bouncing back and forth between doing a little bit and gathering data. If I'm writing my name very carefully, I am going very slowly because I'm taking these micro, like taking data, give direction, taking data, give direction, as opposed to if I read it really quickly and I'm not thinking at all, it goes fast.
Thank you for coming to this. Is not there. I'm working so hard on
I know
getting
you're
that
helping
undone
me.
time written.
Okay, let me put something that feels like a button on it because I appreciate what you're doing. Knowing what to do and actually doing it are two different things. The more you spend on figuring out what to do, the better you get at it. And the more you spend on doing stuff, the better you get at it. And the more you spend on one thing, everything you spend on one thing is something you can't spend on others. So this is part of the neurodiversity thing. If you are somebody who struggles with execution, then almost by definition, unless we're talking about pathological deficiencies, you are also somebody who is better at something else which isn't in that category, maybe coming up with what to do and whatever. You know, people who would spend time on a stream talking about stuff like this, right? People who will sit and think about how they should clean their room and how they should just fold that stuff and put it away and whatever without doing it. And identifying the specifics of like when ideation is valuable and when no, you just have to do it and thinking about it won't do anything. That's an important thing to learn and develop. And one real big thing about this is don't measure how well you are doing by how hard you are working, which is a very common thing in our culture, that if something's easy for me, well, that doesn't really count because that's easy, so that's not valuable. Something's very difficult for me, well, that means I worked very hard. And why aren't people appreciative of this thing that was very difficult for me, even though the outcome of it is not very valuable for people? And why do people keep complimenting me about this thing that's like nothing and I barely even have to pay attention to it, but they act like it's such a big deal?
I want to make money off of those things.
Because people care about the actual outcome, not about how much it costs. And so people, we actually do like deliberately force ourselves to operate in the most inefficient ways possible because, oh man, this thing is so hard for me, I should really make myself do it. Which is,
or for me, sometimes I think this thing is so easy for me, which means I have to do it 1,000 times a week.
Another version is, this thing is so enjoyable and therefore I shouldn't do it, right? That when you look at it from a community perspective, specialization is the optimal way. That each person focuses as much as possible on doing the things that they like and does as little as possible about the things that they don't like or that are difficult. If you think that each person is an individual, each man is an island, as our culture tends to preach, this hyper-individualism, well, then the strategy shifts. And what you should do then is focus on developing your weaknesses. Instead of leaning into the things that you enjoy and do well, you should spend the most of your resources engaged in the things you don't like and that you struggle with. Because if you're all on your own and no one else can take care of those things for you, that's the stuff where it's like, you better figure that out. Otherwise, that's the illusion, the idea that's sold in our culture. But it's nothing to do, including in the way we do academics, right? That like you can get A's and be brilliant and all this stuff, and that one you get an F and you really struggle with. So let's get you a tutor for that. Let's spend more resources on the one you struggle with the most. Completely inefficient, suboptimal way of doing things. So that's my little button to people is, honestly, when you say that you're good or bad at something, the most useful way for me, unless I'm putting that in a specific parameter, like good at doing this observable thing in this observable context. I'm just generally saying, oh, I'm good at math, I'm bad at math, whatever. All that means is like it. The only thing, if we're talking about lifetime output, how good a person is at a thing is the same as how much they enjoy that thing. So
Thank you.
What should be happening is for all of us to be doing as much as possible of the things we enjoy and as little as possible of the things we don't. Not just to be nice to everybody. Thank you for pushing me so hard to wrap up because
it's really uncomfortable for me.
I know if you weren't pushing, I'd be going much longer.
It would be like 2:20.
The extent to which you're pushing is getting me to do it 3 minutes, like, which is so much better, and I appreciate it. Thank you all.
This has been great. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll be here next week. Oh, actually, no, I won't.
I won't be here next week or the week after, or maybe
No stream next week. I will be back the following week. Caitlin will be rejoining us after that. So there will be no stream next week. I'll ask Marie to put that out on social media to remind everyone. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.